They thought they were selling me a worthless patch of dirt for less than $3,000, the kind of property nobody wanted, the kind people forgot existed. What they didn't know was that 3 days later I'd unlock a concrete utility box sitting in the middle of that lot and discover a secret that had been keeping an entire upscale neighborhood alive for nearly 2 decades. And the worst part for them wasn't that I found it. It was that they handed it to me themselves. My name is Ethan Cole, and at the time all this happened, I was living in a modest ranch house outside Brighton, Colorado. Nothing fancy. Gravel driveway, old pickup truck, work boots by the door, and enough electrical jobs lined up every month to keep the lights on and my mortgage paid. I wasn't rich, but I was comfortable. More importantly, I was careful. Being an electrician teaches you that one loose wire hidden behind a wall can burn down an entire house. The same principle applies to people. Most disasters start with something small that everybody ignores. The phone call came on a Thursday afternoon while I was replacing a service panel for a retired couple. The caller introduced himself as Gregory Stanton. His voice sounded polished, expensive somehow, like a guy who spent more time in conference rooms than garages. He told me he represented the board in a neighborhood called Cedar Ridge Commons, a community about 15 minutes east of town. I'd driven past it before. Rows of beautiful townhomes, fancy landscaping, community clubhouse, swimming pool, tennis courts, the whole picture-perfect suburban dream. Gregory said they had a tiny parcel of land they wanted to unload, and someone had recommended me because I occasionally bought odd properties for storage projects. Honestly, he said, it's basically useless. We just want to offer our books. That sentence stuck with me. Nobody calls a stranger trying to get rid of land unless there's a reason. Land is land. Even bad land has value. 2 days later, I drove out to take a look. The property sat behind the tennis courts at the edge of the development. It was small, maybe 20 feet by 30 feet, surrounded by dry grass and cracked soil. At first glance, Gregory seemed right. There wasn't much there. No road access worth mentioning. No room to build anything. No obvious commercial use. But there was one thing. A beige concrete structure sitting near the center of the parcel. About the size of a large garden shed. No windows. Heavy steel door. Low mechanical hum coming from inside. I pointed toward it. What's that? Gregory barely looked at it. Utility equipment. Nothing important. That answer was too fast. People tell the truth slowly. They lie quickly. We walked around the lot while he talked about paperwork, transfer costs, and how nobody had shown interest in buying it. Then he handed me a folder. The purchase documents were already prepared. Signature taps ignited. Every page marked. Almost like he expected me to sign immediately. I flipped through the paperwork and noticed him watching me instead of the documents. That made me smile. Most buyers don't read all this stuff, he said casually. There it was. The sentence that changed everything. Most buyers don't read all this stuff. Maybe he thought it sounded harmless. To me, it sounded like a warning siren. I took the paperwork home and spent the entire weekend going through every page. Then I pulled county records, then tax maps, then zoning documents. Nothing looked unusual. No easements, no recorded agreements, no utility ownership filings connected to the parcel. The deeper I dug, the stranger it became. By Monday morning, I was convinced of 2 possibilities. Either the lot was exactly what Gregory claimed it was, or somebody had forgotten to file something very important years ago. Curiosity has got me into trouble more than once, but it's also saved me a lot of money. I bought the property in cash that Wednesday. Gregory looked relieved when we signed. Not happy, relieved, like a man finally getting rid of a problem. I remember driving home with the deed sitting on the passenger seat beside me. Something didn't feel right. I couldn't explain it. Maybe it was Gregory's forced smile. Maybe it was how eager he had been. Maybe it was the concrete box humming quietly in the middle of nowhere. Whatever it was, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just stepped into a story nobody intended for me to find. 3 days later, with the deed officially recorded and ownership transferred, I grabbed a flashlight, a bolt cutter, and drove back to my new property. The afternoon sun was dropping behind the tennis courts as I walked across the dry grass toward that concrete structure. The hum was louder now, steady, constant, like a heartbeat. I unlocked the outer security latch, pulled the steel door open, and the moment I looked inside, I stopped breathing. Because sitting in front of me wasn't random utility equipment. It was something far bigger. Something that would turn a $2,900 purchase into the most expensive mistake an entire HOA had ever made. For a few seconds, I just stood there staring into that concrete box, trying to convince myself I was misunderstanding what I was looking at. I've spent most of my adult life around electrical systems, transformers, service panels, utility equipment, so this wasn't unfamiliar territory for me. What was unfamiliar was seeing all of it packed into a structure sitting on a piece of privately owned land with absolutely no documentation attached to it. Directly in front of me sat a commercial-grade transformer. Along one wall were water regulation controls. Another section contained circuit panels labeled with permanent engraved tags. I moved closer and started reading them one by one. Pool, clubhouse, tennis court lights, east street lighting, west street lighting, irrigation control, common area power. I remember laughing out loud. Not because anything was funny, but because my brain didn't know how else to process what I was seeing. Every single shared service in Cedar Ridge Commons appeared to flow through that little concrete building. The swimming pool families enjoyed every summer. The decorative lighting that made the neighborhood look like a luxury resort at night. The clubhouse used for birthday parties and board meetings. The irrigation systems that kept the landscaping green. Everything. I locked the door again, drove home, and spent half the night digging through public records. By midnight, I wasn't looking for answers anymore. I was looking for proof that I was wrong. Instead, every document seemed to push me further in the opposite direction. The utility structure had been installed almost 18 years earlier during the original development phase of the community. Yet somehow there was no recorded easement granting permanent access rights. No ownership transfer documents. No lease agreements. No filed encroachments. Nothing. The next morning I called a real estate attorney named Laura Bishop. Laura was the kind of attorney who didn't waste words. When she talked, you listened. After reviewing everything, she asked a simple question. Have you had a survey completed? 3 days later, a licensed survey crew arrived. I watched them work for hours, measuring boundaries, checking markers, reviewing coordinates. By late afternoon, the lead surveyor walked over holding a clipboard. You're not going to believe this, he said. Try me. He pointed to the map. The entire structure is inside your property line. I already suspected it. Hearing it confirmed felt different. Suddenly, this wasn't a theory anymore. It was real. Laura's office prepared a formal letter that same week. The message was straightforward. Remove all structures from my property within 30 days or negotiate legal occupancy terms. No threats. No games. Just property law. Gregory called me less than 4 hours after the letter arrived. Gone was the smooth confidence I'd heard during our first conversation. His voice sounded strained. Ethan, there must be some misunderstanding. I don't think there is. You can't seriously expect us to remove utility infrastructure. Then maybe we should discuss occupancy terms. Silence. Long silence. Then he said something that told me everything. Nobody has ever raised this issue before. I leaned back in my chair. That's not really my problem, is it? He hung up shortly afterward. Over the next few days, things got interesting. Word started spreading through the neighborhood. At first, only board members knew. Then committee members found out. Then residents started hearing rumors. A few homeowners contacted me directly. Most were polite. Some were angry. A handful seemed genuinely terrified. One older woman, named Diane, actually showed up at my house carrying homemade cookies. Please tell me you're not shutting everything off, she said. I almost felt bad for her. Almost. Because none of this was her fault. Most residents had no idea what their HOA leadership had been doing. I explained that I wasn't trying to harm homeowners. I simply expected the same thing every property owner expects. Respect for legal ownership. Diane nodded slowly. Then why does Gregory keep telling everyone you're trying to hold the neighborhood hostage? That question explained a lot. The board wasn't solving the problem. They were managing public perception. They needed a villain, preferably me. A week after sending the notice, I installed an 8-foot security fence around my parcel. Perfectly legal. Professionally installed. The gate included a commercial padlock and a bright sign that read private property. Occupancy negotiations in progress. The reaction was immediate. Photos appeared in neighborhood Facebook groups. Residents argued online. Some supported me. Others claimed I was greedy. One particularly dramatic post described me as an infrastructure pirate. My friends still laugh about that one. Meanwhile, Gregory's attorney sent Laura a threatening letter accusing me of interfering with community operations. Laura's response was beautiful. 3 pages, 27 citations, completely devastating. She outlined potential background claims, unauthorized land usage, liability exposure, and years of unrecorded occupancy. When Gregory received it, he stopped threatening me. Instead, he started trying to negotiate. That's when I learned the real story. Through discovery requests and internal emails that eventually surfaced, we uncovered something remarkable. Several previous board members had known about the ownership issue. Not all of them, but enough. Years earlier, an attorney had reportedly warned the HOA that the utility parcel should be acquired permanently or secured through a recorded easement. The recommendation was ignored because buying the land would cost money. Every board that followed kicked the problem down the road for someone else to handle. 18 years passed. Leadership changed. Records got buried. Residents came and went. The problem never disappeared. It simply waited. Then one day, they decided to clean up miscellaneous assets and sell the parcel. Apparently, nobody bothered verifying whether the utility structure sat on it. Or maybe somebody did verify and assumed the buyer would never investigate. Either possibility was incredible. About 2 weeks into the dispute, Gregory showed up at my house unannounced. The contrast was impossible to miss. The first time I'd met him, he carried himself like a man in complete control. Expensive watch, expensive car, perfect suit. This time his tie was loose. His eyes looked tired. His confidence was gone. We sat on my porch, overlooking the driveway. For a minute, neither of us spoke. Finally, he sighed. "What do you want?" It was the first honest question he'd asked since this began. "I want a fair resolution." Define fair. Compensation for 18 years of unauthorized use. A legitimate purchase agreement. Accountability. Gregory shook his head. The residents are going to blame me. Maybe they should ask why nobody fixed this 18 years ago. He looked away. I remember feeling something unexpected in that moment. Not satisfaction, not sympathy either. Just perspective. Gregory wasn't the entire problem. He was simply the latest person standing in front of it when the bill finally came due. But actions have consequences. Leadership has consequences. If you inherit authority, you inherit responsibility too. The following week, Cedar Ridge Commons scheduled an emergency community meeting. Attendance was massive. People filled every available seat. Homeowners lined the walls. The atmosphere felt less like a neighborhood gathering and more like a courtroom waiting for a verdict. I walked into that room alongside Laura, carrying a binder nearly 4 inches thick. Gregory stood at the front beside several board members. Nobody looked comfortable. Conversations stopped when we entered. You could practically feel the tension hanging in the air. One resident whispered, "That's him." Another crossed his arms and stared. For the next 2 hours, the entire history of the property unfolded piece by piece. Survey reports, county records, legal opinions, internal correspondence. Every document painted the same picture. The HOA had relied on infrastructure sitting on land it did not own. And now that land belonged to me. As the evidence mounted, frustration inside the room shifted directions. Residents who had arrived angry at me slowly turned their attention toward the board. Questions became accusations. Accusations became demands. Gregory's face grew paler with every passing minute. Then finally someone stood up and asked the question everybody wanted answered. "How much is this going to cost us?" The room went silent. Laura looked toward me. I stood up, opened my folder, and prepared to give the answer that would determine whether this entire community chose a peaceful solution or a very expensive war. You could have heard a pin drop in that room. More than 100 homeowners were staring at me, waiting for a number, waiting for somebody to tell them how bad things really were. I looked around for a second before speaking because the truth was I wasn't looking at villains. Most of these people were families who had bought homes, paid their HOA dues, trusted the people elected to manage the community, and assumed everything had been handled properly. They weren't the ones who created the problem. They were the ones inheriting it. Here's my proposal, I said. The community purchases the parcel permanently. We settle the occupancy issue. We close this chapter and move forward. A few people nodded immediately. Others looked skeptical. Then I explained the numbers. The purchase price for the property. Compensation for years of unauthorized use. Legal expenses. Administrative costs. By the time I finished, the total came out to just over $260,000. The reaction was exactly what you'd expect. Some people gasped. A man near the back threw his hands into the air. One homeowner stood up and shouted, "That's extortion." Before I could respond, Laura calmly adjusted her glasses and said, "No, sir. Extortion is demanding money you aren't legally entitled to. This is called negotiating from a position of ownership." The room went silent again. Nobody liked hearing it, but nobody could argue with it either. Then something unexpected happened. An older resident named Frank stood up. He'd lived in Cedar Ridge Commons almost since the neighborhood opened. Everybody seemed to know him. He looked directly at the board and asked a question that cut through all the noise. "Did any of you know this problem existed before the sale?" Nobody answered immediately. That hesitation told the room everything it needed to know. Murmurs spread through the crowd. Frustration turned into anger. Not toward me anymore, but toward the leadership that had allowed the situation to grow unchecked for nearly 2 decades. The meeting stretched on for another hour. People argued. They debated. They calculated costs on their phones. Some wanted to fight. Others wanted to settle. In the end, reality won. A lawsuit would cost more. Relocating the infrastructure would cost dramatically more. Delaying the issue would only make things worse. Eventually a vote was called. One by one, homeowners raised their hands. The settlement passed by an overwhelming margin. I remember looking over at Gregory after the vote. He looked exhausted, like a man carrying the weight of mistakes made long before he arrived. For a moment, our eyes met across the room. Neither of us smiled. Neither of us celebrated. There wasn't really anything to celebrate. The problem had finally been solved, but solving it came at a price. 30 days later, the funds cleared. The property transferred. New easements were recorded correctly. Every legal issue was cleaned up and documented the way it should have been 18 years earlier. The community finally owned the infrastructure it depended on. The crisis was over. The morning after everything became official, Gregory resigned from the HOA board. No dramatic speech. No public fight. Just a short announcement and a quiet exit. I never spoke to him again. Sometimes people ask me if I felt guilty. The answer is honestly no. I didn't create the problem. I didn't hide the records. I didn't ignore the warnings. I simply bought a piece of property and took the time to understand what I owned. If there's a lesson in all of this, it's that details matter. The things people dismiss as boring paperwork often end up controlling outcomes worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. A month after the settlement, I received a letter from one of the homeowners. It wasn't angry. It wasn't threatening. It was actually a thank you note. The writer explained that residents had started demanding greater transparency from the HOA. Financial reports became easier to access. Board meetings became more open. Questions that once got ignored suddenly received answers. In a strange way, the entire mess forced the community to become healthier. I keep that letter in a drawer to this day. Not because of the money. The money was nice, obviously, but because it reminded me that accountability isn't punishment. Accountability is what happens when reality finally catches up with decisions. A few weeks later, I framed 2 documents in my living room. One was the original deed from the tiny parcel I purchased. The other was the final settlement agreement that resolved everything. Visitors always ask why I display them. I usually laugh and tell them they're the most expensive pieces of paper I've ever owned. But privately, they represent something else. They remind me that assumptions are dangerous. Gregory assumed nobody would check. The board assumed nobody would notice. The community assumed everything was fine because it had always been fine before. And all of those assumptions collapsed the moment somebody opened a door and looked inside a concrete box. Even now, years later, I still wonder what would have happened if I had signed those papers without reading them. If I had accepted the story I was given, if I had walked away from that strange little parcel behind the tennis courts. Maybe nothing would have changed. Maybe the problem would still be sitting there waiting for the next unsuspecting buyer. Or maybe somebody else would have discovered it eventually and handled things very differently. That's the part people still argue about whenever I tell this story. Some think I was completely justified. Others think I should have settled for less. A few believe I should have simply handed the land back and moved on. So now I'm curious what you think. If you discovered that an entire neighborhood had been relying on infrastructure built on land you legally owned, and the people responsible either ignored the problem or hoped you'd never find it, what would you have done? Would you have negotiated a settlement like I did, fought even harder, or simply walked away? Let me know down in the comments, because this is one of those stories where everyone seems to draw the line between right and wrong in a different place.